In today's XML stories, we are going to be talking about a government institute who is mandated to collect data from hospitals and give it to the government. But they were running into a lot of issues. Kurt, what were the kind of problems that this government institute was running into, and why did they come to you?
Well, they came to me because they assumed that XML could be the solution to their problems. And well, they were getting all these records in CSV without linking or without reference between different database tables or different sets of information. And a lot of the data was simply wrong. And they thought that XML validation would actually help them to get a better quality of the records or the hospital records that were sent in. So they were thinking they would get a better quality out of that. And that was the reason they came to me. They asked, could you help us if we would implement XML instead of the way we are doing it currently? Do you think that would make a difference? And yes, it did.
Let's backtrack here a little bit. So before this XML was proposed as a solution, the hospital was collecting records from the patients and they were transferring the records, you said, as a CSV file. So it was a textual data that was being collected and then it was being transferred.
Yes.
To the hospital. So the data,
yes.
how was the data actually collected? I'm just trying to understand the actual problem here. How was the data being collected prior to you?
Yes, the data was being collected in CSV files, and CSV files were collected in a zip. And the problem is the systems that were actually wrapping this all up in CSV files and zip files had no way to check the validity or the correctness or the quality of the records sent. So my customer was getting in a lot of records saying, what was the date of this person's hospital visit? And then the answer was something like last Sunday. Or they were even getting dates like the 32nd of March. A lot of mixing also between months and dates, and you know all of this. And the problem my customer was facing is the records came in and they were uploading this to a database in several stages. But last Sunday is not a date a database would recognize. So the database could not load the record because the date was non-existing. And so my customer had no choice but refusing a tens of thousands records long zip file by saying, it is wrong, there's something in there, because we don't have an intermediate stage to cure the data and make sure everything is correct. So we cannot load it to the database and then verify which data is wrong. So you have to sort out the issues. And then they thought, oh, we hear about XML and we hear about XML validation. Would that make a difference for us? And as it currently stands, now they're sending an XML with a date type validated by a schema. So when the schema says the file is right, we know that we can load everything into the database. So that's a major win already.
That's great. So you are now able to do the validation at the data type level. So if it is a date, you get a date, and you force that sort of the data validity by using the XML schema, right? So you were able to ensure that the data is all cross-checked before it actually hits the database for storage.
Yes, and the interesting thing after that is once you load in the database, there's still some validity checks you need to do. Well, this particular software package was used to create the data, but the software package does not exist in the database. We can report things like that, and what we immediately got as a big win is there's tens of thousands of records coming in, and we can immediately spot with this particular patient, that particular doctor visit, there's something wrong with the date, or the doctor did some prestation with the patient that's not in the database. So we cannot like refund stuff because this doctor did something we don't know what he was doing, so the code was wrong. So all this little, but we can say that it's like, oh, we have 9,999 records were okay. They're in the database. There's this one little record somewhere. There is a small mistake. Can you please correct it and then send it back? And that's a lot of frustration taken away both from my customer and all these hospitals who have to send in and no longer are getting full packages refused, but just single records refused. So yes, that was a major win.
Good. I think I understand the problem quite well now. Thanks a lot for that explanation. But how did you start solving this problem? So where did you actually begin introducing XML into this workflow and trying to streamline the data and trying to set up this data validation?
Where it's an interesting question, because of course there are a lot of parties on the hospital and they all have their opinion about the XML they want to send. But I wanted to, there's a law, there's a government law that says we need to have this particular information in record. So I wanted to start from there. So I basically started from the database, and then we made a database schema with all the attributes and relations. And we went back from there. And it was pretty easy to say as soon as so all the negotiations with lawyers, because, well, you need to discuss your diagrams and your schema with lawyers from this government institution, with lawyers from the government. You need to check the law, all the requirements. You have to talk to data analysts because they have their own opinion, and they also have their software to check the databases for, well, for instance, if you're only allowed to have a visit to the dentist once a year, unless something is wrong, or you're required to have at least one if you want refund, they want to do all sorts of checks. So they have their opinion. And so we decided to not talk about XML, but start by making an information model purely on the requirement side. And after that, we made an XML schema, and we also implemented a lot of business rules. So not just an XML schema, but also different mechanisms for validation. And then we went back to all the hospitals and we said, okay, now we can talk about tuning this schema. But now we just have like the basic relations and the basic entities we need for the processes that follow. So we went from the end result back into to the sources, where interestingly, all these hospitals had their own opinion about the model they would like to provide. Very much alike the systems they were using. They said, no, we don't want it like that. We want it like this. So we ended up making small transformations. So we said, okay, if you want to do it that way, this is what needs to be, but here's a small transformation. You use it as your own risk. You're responsible for the data quality, but we sort of enable you to provide the data the way we need it. But here's the mandatory stuff that's directly related, to the law. That's basically this regulation that says this is what we need to know, and this is what we well, this is what we really need as a basic information to approve certain medical records.
So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So start by defining the information model. First, you really need to understand what data you're trying to store in the database, make sure that all the stakeholders are brought into the picture and they understand how the data should really be modeled. So the information model is where you're saying you started. From there, you derive the XML schema, and then from there, you go further down into what the hospitals really needed to enter in order to make sure that the data traveled all its way up to the database. Am I saying that right? I hope I got that right. Yeah.
Oh, yes, that's a very good summary. And interestingly, in this project, I spent sort of 2 months without thinking about XML at all. That was interesting. That was new.
It must have been
So
hard for
yes,
you, for a person who lives and breathes XML, to not think about XML for 2 months. But I understand what you're saying. You're saying XML is a way to get data organized to meet your final needs. So it's very important to understand how that data should be structured before you jump in and try to define how the XML should look. So XML should really kind of like feed into that data model and feed into that information model or information architecture that you're trying to come up with. Were there any challenges that you ran into while doing this implementation, while going from this sort of like this earlier CSV based data exchange to an XML based data exchange? What were some of the challenges that you ran into with this particular project?
typical about XML is it's a hierarchical database format. It gives you some advantages, but it could be challenging to, well, it is challenging one way or another to dump your database information into a hierarchy, which is flat files or well, it's records in rows and tables structure into a full hierarchical structure. It also seemed, or it was obvious that it was also challenging on the incoming end, because we received this information in a nice hierarchical table with some depth, and we had to put that in tables in a database. So we had to go from a hierarchical structure into a flat table structure again. And well, as the developers were database developers, they tried to load the XML directly into the databases, and that failed. Or that was really, really difficult. It took a long time. It blew up the memory of the Oracle databases. And then we decided to have an intermediate XML, generic, so that we could reuse it across projects. And generic XML is sort of more like table, rows, and cell type XML again. So we were basically almost mimicking the CSV structure from the beginning into XML CSV with the validation hierarchical format in between. And with the generic XML, with the tables and rows, it was really easy to load that in the database. So no explosions on the memory of the Oracle database. It smoothly went in. And yeah, I like that approach actually, because we now have a second project going to the same generic table row XML. So it's completely different data model, an XSLT to transform that completely different data model in the same generic table structure, and then the same load code puts it in a different database. It's kind of cool actually.
If I understand it right, I mean, part of the challenge was in trying to go from a hierarchical XML model into a relational database like structure, and that was one of the key challenges that you ran into with this particular project. So let me backtrack a little bit. So why did you actually decide to go with XML? What was that reasoning? So if I understood it right, the main problem was making sure that the data was valid. But how did XML help you here, and why did you choose XML?
I must admit that I was only contacted after the decision was made, so I was not instrumental in making that decision. It's a bit of a history. They got tired of all the sorrows and problems and they ran into with the CSV files in zip. And they said, well, basically the trigger was, if we could only validate the date field before the information comes in, that would be a big help. And then they realized that XML has been used a lot for data interchange because of its nature of being platform and machine and programming language independent. So because of that independency, they choose XML. And it was a good guess because they only realized after I came in that the validating power of XML and the tool set built around XML was much more than they expected. So we've been able to validate much more things than they originally anticipated, simply because of the power of XML. But if you were saying like they made a good guess, yes. So it was sort of a bet. We think XML might be a solution, and it paid off really well in the end.
Oh, that's great, isn't it? Whenever a project kind of pays off in the end. But I'm gonna ask you for a little bit more specifics. How did this pay off in the end? What was the value that the customer got by moving to this sort of an XML world?
The clear value they've got is there's like 100 hospitals extremely enthusiastic about the fact that they now get small validation reports saying of this entire set of data, this particular field and that particular field are wrong. Can you please correct it? Other than, here's the package again, fix it. And the same applies to my customer. They now have the potential to get the best or the correct things out of a package without having to send the entire package back. So they can work on 99% of the data and they just get rid of the small errors that are in there. And we're extensively increasing the business rules on the data because we even can get more quality out of it. One other big plus my customer is getting from this approach is they have a different project where they have to load different data. And as I said before, we're now using the same generic approach to loading in the database. So it's now making a data model, creating a simple XSLT to dump it into this stable format XML, and all the rest happens automatically. So yes, we've been doing 2 projects inside 1 project.
That's great to hear. So it looks like the customer got a lot of value because the quality of data really went up. And rather than worrying about what was wrong in the entire package and having to kind of look into it and figure out where the errors are, they got notified on the specific errors and they were able to kind of address those issues directly. So that certainly is a lot of value for the customer. So good. Thank you so much for sharing this particular story with us. A hospital trying to get its records into an XML format. But hey, you know what? Today I'm talking from publisher speak. So I'd like to see what publishers can get out of this particular story. So is there a way you can tie in what we learned today to what publishers can take away?
Yes. Well, I'm very happy that I could talk about this project because in my experience, it was the very first XML project I did, where XML was chosen mainly because of its validating power. And in a sense, I've been doing this in publishing as long as I've been working with XML, since it is very relevant. Although it's a very extreme case, validation is and the power of being able to check the quality of your XML is relevant to all XML, be it checking simply the dates in your metadata, or checking the authors from a list, or inside a journal article, make sure that if the date is mentioned, it is correct, or if a chemical substance is referenced in journal article that is existing in a list somewhere. So the power of validation is everywhere. As long as we can set it up, it could help us easily to improve our or improve the quality of our XML in any case. So, and I think it's, well, validation has been relevant in almost every XML project I ever did. Not in an extreme case as the project today, but definitely at least at some level.
That's a great point. As publishers, we care about the validity of the data that we're publishing. We want to make sure that it is as correct as possible. And using XML as the medium helps us put in a lot of these business rules, helps us make sure that the validation is set up correctly, that the content is actually as correct as possible and as valid as possible when it is actually getting published. So thank you so much, Gert.